Hey everyone, welcome back to Every Day with Jesus. We are on day 53 and we are looking at Jesus speaking to the disciples about their witness. We talked last time about how they were going to be going out into the towns of Israel and proclaiming the message of the kingdom to them. And he's going to begin to talk to them about the opposition and persecution that they're going to face. Again, this is probably not just in reference to them going through the towns and villages preparing the way for Jesus, but actually to their future ministry as apostles for Jesus Christ to the very ends of the earth. And so we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 10. We're looking at verses 16 through 25. And so my encouragement to you is to read over that. Again, it's Matthew chapter 10, verses 16 through 25. And the question as it relates to us today is, how should we as Christians think about opposition? Should our goal be that we're never opposed, that we don't stir the pot, so to speak, or should we try to stir the pot? And so anyway, we'll address those questions. Again, our passage is Matthew chapter 10, verses 16 through 25. Jesus isn't going to finish talking about persecution here, but we're going to try to break up this lesson a little bit over probably the next couple of days. So after you've read that, then we'll come back and we'll look at it verse by verse. Okay, Jesus says that I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Really interesting here. And Jesus is basically saying, you know what, I'm sending you into a place where you're not going to be very protected. You imagine the scene of a shepherd guarding his flock. And this is kind of the scene of a church, right? As a shepherd, another name for shepherd is pastor, guarding the flock. And he says, but I'm actually sending you out of the flock. I'm sending you out into the world. And that's where wild animals are. And he says, and so he said, you need to be on your guard, right? And he says to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Now, why does he mention these two things? Well, I think for just a number of reasons. One, he's saying, look, as Christians, we have to make good decisions. I know that I've often described myself as having a foot-shaped mouth, and that I say things that I probably shouldn't say. I jump into things before I always know all the information. And so Jesus says, you know what? You've got to be very careful in the way that you conduct yourself in the world. And so we don't need to do things as Christians that are just going to make people mad, that are just going to make people dislike Christianity even more. And I find this happens most often with those of us who know a little bit about the Bible. That is, we have a little bit of a foundation in theology. We understand doctrine. And sometimes, especially when I was younger, but sometimes I still stick my foot in it, so give me grace. But we'll have a tendency, I think, as Christians to say things just to antagonize people, just to get them riled up, tell them things that may be true, but they're not wise. They're not going to do anything to win that person's heart to Jesus Christ. They're only going to do things to further create a barrier. And so as Christians, we do have to be wise in how we engage with the world. But he says also we have to be careful of the other sin where we just compromise. We just give in and we just say, oh, okay, well, if that's the case, if you're not going to like something I'm going to say, then I'm just not going to say it. And we make our whole goal fitting in with the culture around us. And he says that's not right either. And so while we shouldn't try to be antagonizing people, we also shouldn't try to be just like them. We need to be wise, but we also need to be innocent. And so he says, beware of men. Now, I want to be careful here because when Jesus says beware of men, he's not saying to be afraid of men. And you'll notice if you read verses 26 through 32, several times over he'll say, fear not, do not fear them, do not be afraid of them. So he's not saying be afraid. He's just saying be aware, right? Know that persecution is coming. Be aware of men, or beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. So one of the first instructions Jesus gives here as far as opposition and persecution is that we should expect it. We should anticipate as Christians, there are people that are going to oppose us. There are people that are not going to like us. There are people that are going to hate us for our message. That doesn't mean we compromise the message, even though we need to deliver it wisely. But we should just acknowledge that I know if I'm telling people about Jesus, there's certain people that are not going to like what I'm going to say. And some people would say, well, why is that? I mean, wasn't Jesus a loving and gracious person? And I would say, well, yes, but not always. Jesus also would tell people things about themselves, that they were going to hell. And the message of the gospel, while it is a message of salvation, there are parts of the message of the gospel that people don't like. For example, when we're telling people of their need for a Savior, we're also telling them that they are sinful, they are displeasing in the eyes of God, and ultimately there's nothing they can do to save themselves. And so it's almost like saying God doesn't like you very much, which is not right. But that's what some people hear when we say it, right? That we hear them saying, hey, you know what? God's not happy with you. And you can't make things right with God on your own. And so people hear that like, wait a minute. And then when we go beyond that and say, and the only way you can be saved is by surrendering your life to Jesus Christ, they're going to go, well, wait a minute. So you're saying all the other people, all of them, all of other religions, they're all going to hell. That's what you think. And we would have to say, yes, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man can come to the Father except through me. And so you can understand, people go, that's very offensive. And they suddenly get angry with you. And especially in Jesus' day, people are not just going to get angry because of that, but they're also going to be angry because crowds of people are suddenly listening to the disciples and the religious leaders. It's threatening their establishment. It's threatening their authority and power. And so many people, for many different reasons, oppose Christianity. They're still parts of the world where people don't even allow churches. Why? Because it opposes their power structure in the world. They don't like the idea that someone would have more allegiance to Jesus Christ than they would to their government. And so again, he says that opposition is just going to be expected. But he's also going to say that we need to see that opposition and persecution has a purpose in our life. He says, verse 18, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. And so he's saying, yes, I've actually am allowing persecution in your own life. And we're actually going to see that there's, at least in this passage, 5 reasons that God allows persecution and opposition in our life. And he says, one is when someone's arrested and they're brought to trial, they're able to witness for Christ in behalf of very powerful and important people. And he says, so this persecution, a lot of times, he said, will give you a platform to share the message of Jesus Christ with people. And he says, so he will use that. God will use persecution, use opposition, so that we might bear witness to who Jesus is, and actually gives us an audience to talk about who Jesus Christ is. And so this is one of the things we find happening in the book of Acts repeatedly with the Apostle Paul, that he is able to bear witness to Jesus Christ even among kings and rulers because of the persecution that's happening. And so he says, when they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. That's verse 19. And so Jesus says, don't worry about what you're going to say. Now, I want to be clear on here that Jesus is not saying if you're a preacher, you don't have to prepare your sermon. If you are a Bible study leader, then you don't have to prepare your message. No, that's ridiculous. The Bible says study to show yourself approved. A workman before the Lord who rightly divides the word of truth. Absolutely you should study. Absolutely you should prepare. He's saying don't worry if you are arrested, if you're called to bear witness, even if someone says, well, why do you believe that you haven't prepared what you're going to say. He says, just trust that God is going to work in that moment to give you the words to say. And so a second reason for persecution and opposition is it teaches us, it helps us learn to trust God, to say, you know what, I don't know what's going to happen in this situation. These people don't like me. These people seem to be very opposed to me and my message. And it should never become an us versus them thing, which unfortunately in my own culture in North America, I think Christianity sometimes sees itself in that lens. That shouldn't be the way at all. There are two kingdoms. We're going to talk about that. But the reality is we should always want and hope that lost people come to know Jesus Christ. But in the meantime, it's teaching us also to trust God, to give us the words to say, to help us know how to stand up for our faith and to be faithful with the message of Scripture. And so he says, verse 20, for it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Verse 21, he says, brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. And so he's also saying that opposition will even come from within our own families. Now, you would say, well, why would that be? Well, in a lot of cases, it's because as Christians, oftentimes we're breaking social expectations. We're saying things that our community doesn't like. We're going places and doing things that people just find weird and strange. And so for that reason, even a lot of times people will face opposition from members of their own family. And I can say that I'm very blessed that my family not only have been very supportive of I and Sarah and our family going into the mission field, but they've even, many of them come on our support team to help us do that. But the reality is for many, many missionaries, or many people that strive and want to be missionaries, I had a professor of evangelism tell me this, that the biggest hindrance that they face is their own families trying to keep them from going. Like, how could you go there to that part of the world? Why would you want to leave and tell these people, what about me? Who's going to take care of me when I'm older? What about, are you just going to leave me here alone by myself? How could you do this? I know missionaries now on the field whose parents barely speak to them because they left and went to another country. And so the reality is we have to understand that opposition will even come from members of our own family. It won't just come from those people that we might think enemies of the church, but a lot of times opposition will even come from within the church. In fact, this is what Jesus says in verse 22. He says, you will be hated by all for my name's sake. And I can say, as a pastor, I don't know how many times that I had people angry at me, and opposing things that I said simply because I was affirming that the Bible was true. I was affirming that what the Bible said is what it meant. People didn't like that. People would get very angry at you for it. And so just know that if you're going to try to live for Jesus and you're going to preach a message and you're going to tell people the truth about Jesus, that you're going to face opposition from all sorts of places. And he says, you will be hated by all, verse 22, for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And so what he's saying there, though, is that opposition also has another purpose, right? It gives us a platform to bear witness to God. It teaches us to trust God through difficult circumstances, but it also helps identify who the genuine church is. In other words, that many people, when Jesus tells the parable of the sower, he talks about people that fall away during trials and times of tribulation because they have no root in themselves. And there's a lot of people in churches that aren't really Christians, and persecution and opposition actually helps weed them out. And so some people are very upset that the culture in the United States, where I'm from, has turned against the church in many ways. I think there's a lot of areas where the culture still is with the church, and especially in certain parts of America. But in many ways, the culture has turned against the church. And so people are like, wow, this is so sad because so many people are leaving the church now and they're not coming back. But the reality is actually the church is a purer version of itself because the people who are there are the ones that genuinely love Jesus. They're not just the ones that are playing church. And so what Jesus is going to tell us is there's actually two kingdoms in the world. There's the kingdom of this world and there's the kingdom of our God. And so one of the things persecution does and opposition does is it helps really define who are the people that are with Christ, who are the people that are not with Christ. And how do you tell? Well, the one who endures. The one who endures through opposition. The one who endures through persecution. Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, right, the two houses that were built, and when the winds came against them, right, the one that fell was the one that wasn't really built on the rock. And so he goes on, verse 23, he says, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. Does this mean that missionaries and ministers should never stay in difficult situations? No, not at all. I don't believe that's what Jesus is saying. I think when he's saying when the town as a whole opposes you, you're going to be opposed everywhere you go. But when the entire group of people is not interested in you and they are coming against you, he says, go ahead and leave that area. And you might say, well, wow, why not stay? Why not try to win them over? Why not try to work? Well, I think what he's saying is, first of all, persecution, a fourth aspect of it, is sometimes it shows us where the Spirit is moving and shows us where the Spirit is not moving. Clearly, if a whole community of people hate me and want me to leave, that's a pretty good sign that the Spirit's not moving in that area. But the reason is that God is actually using that to move us to people that need to hear the gospel. Because look what he says. He says, truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And so here's what we have happening actually in the book of Acts. You could read it. I think it's Acts chapter 7 or 8, somewhere in there. And the church begins facing persecution from the Apostle Paul and other people. And so the church scatters after Stephen is stoned. But the thing is, they bring the gospel with them to all the places we go. And we see how God has used persecution to actually spread them out to the nations rather than keep them all gathered in Jerusalem. And so sometimes God will use persecution so that we can bring the gospel to people that haven't heard it by moving us from one place to another place. And so sometimes persecution, sometimes opposition actually shows us what the will of the Spirit is. Because when it says, hey, what I'm doing here isn't working anymore. These people aren't receiving the message anymore. Or these people aren't open to receiving the message. So it's the Spirit's way of pushing me into another area so that everyone can hear the message of the gospel. And finally, he says this in verses 24 and 25. He said, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul. Now you remember the Pharisees saying this about Jesus. It's by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. How much more will they malign those of his household? He says, so look, they persecute me. They're going to persecute you. And so finally, another way that persecution and opposition actually benefits us is it helps identify us with Jesus Christ. And so when the apostles we find in the book of Acts were persecuted, it says that they counted it joy, the privilege of being able to share in the sufferings of Christ. And so one of the ways that we can have assurance of our salvation, now again, not by being a jerk, not by being antagonistic to the culture, but one of the ways we can have assurance of our salvation is if we find people oppose us for our faith, it lets us know that we really are living for Jesus. And that's the calling that God has given us, to be witnesses for Jesus, to make disciples for Jesus, and to live for Jesus. God bless you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow.